In 1953, a furniture salesman in Cincinnati made a claim in a trade journal that would have struck most European housewives as either audacious or absurd. He wrote, flatly and without irony, that the vanity table was the single most important piece of furniture a woman could own. Not the bed, not the dining table, not the kitchen counter around which entire family rhythms organized themselves. The vanity. A piece of furniture that served one explicit function: the cultivation and maintenance of a woman's face. That claim tells you nearly everything you need to know about the cultural architecture of mid-century America, where a woman's appearance was not merely a personal preference, but a social obligation, a domestic performance, and in many households, a near sacred daily rite. The vanity table was its altar. Walk into any department store in the United States between 1948 and 1959, and you would encounter an entire floor given over to bedroom furniture suites, in which the vanity table occupied pride of place. It sat between the twin beds or faced the window, flanked by matching nightstands and crowned by a wide, slightly tilted mirror that caught the morning light at precisely the angle manufacturers had studied. These were not incidental objects. The major American furniture houses, Drexel, Heywood-Wakefield, Bassett, and the great Grand Rapids manufacturers whose names graced the labels sewn inside their upholstered benches, produced vanity tables as centerpieces of their flagship bedroom collections, and they advertised them accordingly. Glossy magazine spreads showed a woman seated at her vanity the way a queen might sit upon a throne, composed, deliberate, radiant, in control. The physical object itself varied enormously by price and pretension, but its essential anatomy remained consistent. There was the tabletop, usually finished in walnut veneer or painted in soft white lacquer, long enough to accommodate the spread of bottles and jars and compacts that constituted a serious toilette. There was the mirror, often triptych in design, a large central panel flanked by two angled wings that allowed a woman to see her profile without the awkward gymnastics of craning her neck. There was the bench, or stool, almost always upholstered, frequently in fabric that matched the bedroom's drapes or coverlet, because coordination was a virtue in 1953, and a woman who let her vanity bench clash with her curtains was quietly, mercilessly judged by the women who came to visit. And there were the drawers. Always the drawers, shallow, lined in felt or thin paper, smelling permanently of powder and cold cream, and the faint ghost of 100 perfumes. What filled those drawers and covered that tabletop was itself a kind of autobiography. The particular arrangement of a woman's vanity surface revealed her priorities, her budget, her aspirations, and her private rituals as legibly as a diary. A woman who kept a jar of Pond's cold cream front and centre was signalling one kind of careful domesticity. A woman who scented a cut-glass bottle of Chanel No. 5 was broadcasting another kind of status altogether. The placement of the rouge compact, the position of the hairbrush, sterling silver or plain tortoiseshell, the presence or absence of a dedicated mascara wand versus a cake block and a wet brush. All of it communicated something. Women understood this. They arranged their vanities the way they set their dining tables, with intention. The connection to earlier centuries was not lost on the women who wrote for home furnishing magazines during this period, and those magazines returned to it repeatedly. The dressing table had existed in some form since the 17th century, when aristocratic European women first began devoting specific pieces of furniture to the rituals of grooming. By the Georgian era, it had become an elaborate piece of cabinetry, fitted with compartments and lockable boxes and hinged mirrors that folded flat when not in use. The Victorians had produced their own version, heavy with dark wood and bristling with small mirrors and tiny drawers, and called it a dressing table or a toilet table, the word toilet carrying none of the modern associations but simply derived from the French toilette, meaning the act of washing and dressing oneself. The 1950s, American vanity inherited all of this history and stripped it of its heaviness its excessive ornamentation, its Victorian gravity, and replaced those qualities with the sleek optimism that defined post-war design. Clean lines, pale colours, a sense of lightness and possibility. The post-war economic boom made the well-appointed vanity table accessible to women who a generation earlier could never have imagined owning one. During the Depression, a woman applied her tangy lipstick in the bathroom mirror beside the medicine cabinet, or held a hand mirror up to catch the window light, or simply did what she could without a dedicated space. The war years were no better. But after 1945, as the suburbs expanded and new houses were built at breathtaking speed, and returning soldiers married and bought furniture on installment plans, the master bedroom suddenly became a space with room to breathe. The vanity table moved in, and it brought with it an entire new commercial infrastructure. The cosmetics industry, the toiletries manufacturers, the perfume houses, the brush and comb set producers, who had been waiting for exactly this kind of domestic real estate to colonize. The bench in front of the vanity was where the day began and where it ended. In the morning, a woman sat there to build her face, foundation smoothed with a damp sponge, powder pressed with a puff until the skin no longer reflected but absorbed the light, brows penciled in the high, precise arch that Ava Gardner and Lana Turner had made synonymous with composure, lashes curled with a rubber-padded metal device that looked vaguely medieval, mascara applied with a small spiral brush dampened at the tongue, lipstick last, always lipstick last, blotted on a tissue that left behind an impression so characteristic, that particular pressed lip ghost of pigment, that it became one of the most recognizable visual signatures of the era. At night she returned to undo it all, and the unmaking was as ritualized as the making. Cold cream, tissue, toner on a cotton ball, and then the preparatory work for the next morning's face, the pin curls clipped into place, the night cream patted gently around the eye socket, the brows combed upward and set with a tiny brush. The vanity table watched all of this. It held the evidence of it, the rings left by perfume bottles, the powder bloom that settled over everything if you were not careful about capping your compact, the stray hairpin that appeared in the hinge of the mirror no matter how many times you removed it. It was, in the most fundamental sense, a witness to the most private performances of femininity. Those moments when a woman was neither finished nor begun, when she existed in the threshold between her private self and her public presentation. That threshold was not, in 1953, a space of radical feminist self-examination, but it was a space of extraordinary power, and the women who occupied it every morning and every night understood its weight, even if the vocabulary to articulate that understanding had not yet been invented. Today, the vanity table is returned, rebranded as the glam station on home improvement programs, and the subject of obsessive vanity tour videos, in which beauty enthusiasts display their collection of highlighters and serums with the same pride their grandmothers reserved for a full set of Revlon's matching fire and ice nail enamel and lipstick. The aesthetic has shifted. LED ring lights have replaced triptych mirrors, acrylic organizers stand in for felt-lined drawers, but the impulse is identical, a dedicated space for the face, a surface that belongs to the project of appearance. An altar, by any other name, to the particular and enduring power of looking like yourself, only better. The economics of the vanity table market during this decade reveal a commercial infrastructure of remarkable sophistication. Furniture manufacturers worked in deliberate coordination with cosmetics companies, and this coordination was not always visible to consumers, but was absolutely legible to anyone who read the trade press. A furniture house launching a new bedroom suite would approach the advertising department of Revlon, or Max Factor or Helena Rubinstein with a proposal. Their suite would be photographed for magazine advertisements, with the cosmetics company's products arranged on its vanity surface. The cosmetics company received aspirational placement in a setting of domestic authority. The furniture company received glamour by association. Both parties benefited, and the consumer received the message, implicitly but unmistakably, that the well-appointed vanity table required specific products to be complete, that the suite was only a stage and the cosmetics were the performance. The physical design of the vanity table also accommodated itself to the particular demands of mid-century cosmetics use in ways that are easy to overlook in retrospect. The shallow depth of the standard vanity surface, typically 16 to 18 inches from the mirror rail to the front edge, was precisely calculated, deep enough to accommodate a full arrangement of bottles and boxes without crowding, shallow enough that the woman seated at the bench could reach every object without leaning forward in a way that strained the back. The height of the surface, typically 28 to 30 inches, roughly counter-height by the standards of the period, placed the mirror at a level where a seated woman of average height could see her face from the mid-forehead to the chin without tilting her head. These were not accidental measurements. The furniture designers of the post-war period consulted, informally or formally, with the domestic science advisors who were among the most influential professional women of the era, the home economists employed by universities and manufacturers who measured and tested and published papers about the ergonomics of feminine domestic labour. The bench that sat before the vanity table was the most intimate contact point between the woman and the furniture, and its design was consequently the most carefully considered. Too high, and it placed the vanity surface at chest level. Too low, and it strained the neck and shoulders. The upholstered top was non-negotiable in the better suites. A woman who was to spend 45 minutes at a surface every morning required a surface that did not cause discomfort before she had finished. The padding beneath the upholstery was a genuine engineering consideration. Too soft, and the user sank in ways that compromised the height calibration. Too firm, and it was merely a padded board. And the fabric, always coordinated with the bedroom soft furnishings in the advertised ideal, was in practice subject to the same hazards as any upholstered seat in proximity to cosmetics. The powder settling on it, the occasional smear of cold cream from a sleeve, the hairpin that dug into the fabric and left a small impression. Women covered their vanity benches with matching fabric slip covers, or kept them brushed, or simply accepted the evidence of use as the patina of a piece that was actually being employed for its intended purpose. The moment at which a woman's daughter first sat at the vanity table was understood as a rite of passage, quietly significant whether or not it was explicitly acknowledged. A girl of 8 or 9 might perch at the bench and be permitted to smell the perfume stoppers, to press her fingertip into the powder puff and observe the small handprint it left on the back of her hand. At 12 or 13 she might be allowed to apply a dab of the palest pink lipstick on a special occasion, the tube chosen with care by the mother for minimum chromatic impact. At 15 or 16 she might be given her own small section of the vanity surface, a corner of the mirror, a single drawer, for her own developing collection of beauty tools. The vanity table was where femininity was transmitted between generations, where the rituals were learned by observation and then by practice, where a daughter sat and watched and slowly absorbed the knowledge that her mother was spending down every morning, the accumulated intelligence of years of daily work at that surface. The social geography of the vanity table within the bedroom suite was also a matter of deliberate domestic negotiation. In the 2-bedroom suburban houses that the post-war building boom was producing at a rate of hundreds of thousands per year, the master bedroom was sized to accommodate both a double bed and a vanity table, but the allocation of space between these two claims was not always straightforward. The vanity table, with its bench pulled out and its surface extended with the full deployment of a serious cosmetics collection, could claim a substantial portion of a modest room. Husbands who had been raised in households where the bedroom was a neutral, jointly owned space occasionally found the colonization of a corner by a piece of furniture that was entirely a wife's domain, that he had no reason to approach, and would have looked slightly ridiculous approaching. A minor domestic strangeness to be accommodated. Most did accommodate it without remark. The vanity table was understood to belong to the bedroom the way the kitchen belonged to the kitchen. A space organised around a specific labour that the household required. There is a moment that every woman who owned a Triptych vanity mirror in the 1950s will remember, or would remember if she were still here to recall it. The first time she angled those side panels inward and caught, for the first time with any real clarity, the full circumference of her own face. The experience was described in letters, in diaries, in the pages of women's magazines, with a consistent mixture of fascination and mild horror. The profile, it turned out, was a stranger. The back of the coiffed hair, that carefully constructed edifice of waves and pin curls and lacquered curves, looked from behind either like exactly what it was meant to be, a masterwork of feminine architecture, or like a slightly alarming series of mistakes that nobody at the front had noticed. The Triptych mirror was an instrument of revelation, and not all of its revelations were comfortable. The three-panelled mirror had its origins in the dressing tables of the European aristocracy, where elaborate lacquered and gilded looking-glass arrangements had allowed wealthy women since the 18th century to examine themselves from multiple angles simultaneously. The Georgian toilet mirror, hinged and adjustable on its box base, gave a woman her profile. The great mirrored armoires of Victorian dressing rooms showed her at full length, but it was the American furniture manufacturers of the post-war period who democratized the Triptych vanity mirror and installed it in tract houses across the continent, transforming what had once been a luxury of the privileged into a standard fixture of suburban domesticity. By the early 1950s, the Triptych mirror was so expected, a feature of the bedroom vanity, that its absence registered as an omission, like a dining table without chairs. The mechanics of the thing were precise and, once understood, deeply satisfying. The large central panel, typically measuring somewhere between 20 and 24 inches in width and standing between 30 and 36 inches tall, was fixed, bolted or mounted to the back rail of the vanity table's surface. The two side panels were hinged to it and swung freely, each one roughly half the width of the centre. When the side panels were pushed outward and flat, they caught the ambient light of the room and showed the world as a wide reflected panorama. When angled inward, they created a geometry of reflections in which a woman appeared not once but 3 times, directly and on each side, and if she angled them very precisely, she could create an infinite corridor of diminishing cells receding into the glass. That multiplication of reflection had a specific practical function. The foundation had to be blended evenly into the jaw, which meant checking both sides. The hair at the temples had to match. The false eyelash, if she wore one, had to be seated as perfectly on the left lid as the right. The seam where her lipstick met the natural line of her upper lip had to be clean from all angles. The Triptych mirror allowed this kind of exhaustive self-examination, and the women of the 1950s were nothing if not exhaustive in their approach to appearance. A survey published in a 1954 issue of one major women's magazine found that American women spent an average of 45 minutes at their vanity each morning, not counting the time required for bathing. That number seems almost impossibly modest given the labour involved in recreating the decade's preferred silhouette of smooth, matte skin, sculpted brows and architectural hair. But it was what women reported, and there is no particular reason to doubt them. The mirror manufacturers, and this was a genuine industry, separate from the furniture makers, specialised firms in New Jersey and Ohio and Pennsylvania, who produced the glass and the framing separately for assembly, competed on the quality of their reflections in ways that were both technical and poetic. The silver backing of a good vanity mirror was meant to produce what industry catalogues of the period called a true reflection, meaning one undistorted by the slight waviness that afflicted cheaper glass. A warped mirror, and cheap mirrors were frequently warped, their backing applied unevenly, their glass not quite flat, could produce a face that appeared subtly but disturbingly wrong, with a jaw slightly narrower on one side than the other, or a brow that curved when it should have been level. Women noticed. The better furniture showrooms made a point of displaying their vanity mirrors against white backgrounds so that customers could test the reflection before committing to a purchase, holding up a straight edge or simply staring hard into the glass to assess its honesty. The frame of the mirror was its own aesthetic statement, coordinated with the vanity table and bench into a suite that the furniture houses branded with evocative names. The Reverie Suite, the Romance Suite, the Boudoir Classic, that explicitly invoke the feminine dreamscape of mid-century aspiration. Blonde wood frames suited the Heywood-Wakefield modernist aesthetic that was popular in early 50s California-influenced interiors. Dark walnut frames with brass hardware suited the more formal Drexel heritage suites that were advertised in the back pages of House Beautiful and suggested a woman who took her furniture as seriously as she took her face. White lacquer frames, often with gold trim, suggested the Hollywood glamour that every suburb secretly desired. The frame told a story about who you were or who you hoped to become, which in 1953 amounted to the same thing. What the Triptych mirror could not show was also in its way significant. It could not show the loose thread at the hem of a dress, visible only from below. It could not show the run beginning in a stocking at the back of the calf. It could not show the expression on a woman's face as she moved through the world when she did not know she was being observed. In this sense, the vanity mirror, for all its multi-panel comprehensiveness, showed only what a woman chose to submit to its examination. She stood before it on her own terms, at her own hour, with the window light or the vanity lamp positioned exactly as she preferred. The vanity mirror was, in the end, the most cooperative of audiences. It showed what was offered and judged nothing. The culture of the Triptych mirror persists in curious contemporary forms. The three-way mirror in the fitting room dressing cubicle is its direct descendant, and produces in modern shoppers the same complex cocktail of the vanity mirror's revelation. The profile that is not quite as expected, the back of the hair caught at an angle that is somehow both familiar and foreign, the multiplied selves arranged in a corridor of reflection that creates a vertiginous sense of infinite self-examination. Today's beauty influencers who film their makeup tutorials between two ring-lit mirrors flanking their camera are recreating the Triptych geometry without necessarily knowing they are doing so, seeking that same comprehensive visibility, that same all-angles assurance that the work of the face is complete and without flaw. The three-panelled mirror of 1953 looks across the decades and recognises the impulse exactly. The Triptych mirror's relationship to photographic culture in the 1950s was more complex and more consequential than it might initially appear. The women who sat before their three-panelled mirrors every morning were, in a very real sense, preparing themselves for the camera, even when no camera was present. The ideal of feminine appearance during this period was constructed almost entirely through photographic images. The magazine advertisement, the Hollywood film still, the department store catalogue, the home photography that had become accessible to ordinary families through the proliferation of the Brownie camera and its successors. These images presented a visual standard of appearance that was itself a product of specific photographic conditions: professional lighting, professional retouching, the selective truth of the photographic lens. Women absorbed these images and reconstructed them as their personal standards of appearance, which meant that they were preparing themselves, at their vanity mirrors every morning, to meet a standard derived from conditions they could never quite replicate. The mirror in the vanity table had its own distortions, different in kind from those of the photograph, but equally significant. A mirror shows a laterally reversed image. The left side of the face appears on the right, and vice versa, which means that what a woman saw in her vanity mirror was not what other people saw when they looked at her, but a minor image of it. This reversal, familiar enough that it registered only in specific moments of dissonance, had practical implications for the application of makeup. The line drawn from left to right in the mirror was being drawn, in physical reality, from right to left, which required a muscular recalibration that most women performed unconsciously, but that could produce errors in precision work. The woman who drew her eyeliner in the mirror's reverse world and then appeared in a photograph, which restored the true orientation, sometimes noticed with a jolt that the arch of her brows was not quite the same from each side, that one eye had received a slightly more confident line than the other. The mirror had told her one truth, the photograph told her another. The mythology of the vanity mirror in mid-century popular culture was pervasive and almost always ambivalent. The wicked queen in the fairy tale possessed a talking mirror that told her the truth she did not want to hear. In the popular imagination of the 1950s, the vanity mirror was the opposite. A cooperative accomplice in the cultivation of a flattering self-image, a friend who said what one needed to hear. Women's magazine articles with titles like "Your Mirror, Friend or Foe" addressed directly the question of whether the vanity mirror was telling women the truth about their appearance or offering them a self-serving version of it. The articles concluded, almost invariably, that the mirror was only as honest as the light in which it was used, and the willingness of its user to look at what it showed rather than what she hoped to see. The psychological research on self-image and mirror use that would emerge in academic psychology during the 1960s and 70s had its roots in observations that were being made, less formally and more impressionistically, by the beauty editors and home economists of the 1950s. They noticed that some women avoided the Triptych mirror's side panels entirely, never angling them inward, never confronting the profile or the back of the head. They noticed that other women spent what seemed like excessive time in front of the mirror, not the productive time of skilled application, but the unproductive time of anxious examination, searching the surface for flaws that then required correction, which produced new surfaces for examination, in a recursive loop that consumed morning time and produced anxiety. They wrote about these patterns with the practical concern of people interested in the efficiency of the morning routine rather than the clinical concern of psychologists, but they were documenting something real, that the mirror on the vanity table was a powerful psychological instrument whose effects on the women who used it were not uniformly beneficial. The specific quality of the reflection that different mirror backings produced was not merely an aesthetic consideration, but a technical one with commercial consequences. A manufacturer whose mirrors produced a slightly greenish tint, a defect caused by iron impurities in the glass that were difficult to eliminate entirely without expensive refining, would find that customers returned the product or complained that it made their faces look unwell. The silver backing applied to the back of the glass determined almost everything about the mirror's colour quality, and the better manufacturers guarded their backing formulas as genuine trade secrets, employing chemists to monitor and maintain the consistency of their silver nitrate solutions and their atmospheric vapour deposition processes. This level of technical care went unmentioned in the furniture advertisements that showed the vanity table bathed in romantic light, but it was what made the romantic light possible to see accurately. The Triptych mirror on the well-equipped 1950s vanity table was, in its quiet way, a precision instrument. The practice of reading a mirror, assessing its quality before purchase, was a skill that the more knowledgeable department store shoppers of the period exercised with the confidence of specialists. A slightly convex surface, which could be detected by holding a straight-edged object against the glass and observing whether the reflection of the edge remained straight, produced a face that appeared slightly wider than reality. A slightly concave surface produced the opposite distortion, a face that seemed narrower and longer than reality, an effect that some women found accidentally flattering, and therefore tolerated in a mirror they might otherwise have returned. The level of optical literacy required to navigate the vanity mirror market was not nothing, and the women who possessed it had typically developed it through the unpleasant education of purchasing a mirror, living with it for a week, and then recognizing, with some frustration, that the flattering quality it had seemed to possess in the store was the product of a curvature that made the face in the reflection slightly different from the face in the world. In 1951, Revlon introduced a fragrance called Intimate, in a bottle shaped like a woman's torso, cut from heavy crystal and stoppered with a gold cap that screwed on with a precision that felt almost mechanical in its satisfying finality. The bottle was deliberately, almost aggressively beautiful, and it was designed with the explicit understanding that it would spend most of its life sitting on a woman's vanity table, where other women would see it. This was not a secondary consideration. It was the primary one. The perfume inside Intimate was perfectly pleasant, a warm oriental accord of amber and musk that sat comfortably within the conventions of mid-century fragrance. But what Revlon was really selling was the bottle. The bottle was the status symbol. The bottle was the conversation piece. The bottle was the jewel that sat on the vanity surface and caught the morning light and told every woman who visited the bedroom something immediate and unmistakable about the woman who lived there. The 1950s were the golden age of the perfume bottle as decorative object, and the vanity table was its natural habitat. This was partly a matter of economics. Post-war prosperity had put disposable income in the hands of American women who had not previously had it, and the major fragrance houses recognized quickly that these women wanted luxury objects they could display, and partly a matter of deliberate marketing strategy. The great perfumers of the era, from the American houses like Revlon and Coty to the French imports like Lanvin and Guerlain and Chanel, understood that the vanity surface was a gallery, and they competed to place their most beautiful objects in it. Bottle design became as important as fragrance formulation, and some of the most brilliant industrial designers of the 20th century directed their attention to the problem of how to make a small glass vessel capable of holding perhaps 3 ounces of liquid into a piece of art. The range of what appeared on American vanity tables during this period was extraordinary. At the accessible end of the market were the offerings from Coty, whose Le Mans came in a simple fluted bottle of clear glass that was unpretentious but elegant, and Evening in Paris by Bourjois, whose distinctive dark cobalt blue glass was as instantly recognizable as a Coca-Cola bottle, and about as widely distributed. Evening in Paris was everywhere. Drug stores, dime stores, department store, cosmetics counters, gift sets assembled at Christmas and presented in blue satin boxes that daughters gave to mothers and husbands, gave to wives and young women bought for themselves with the same slight flutter of aspirational pleasure. The cobalt blue bottle sat on countless vanity tables in middle-class American homes throughout the 1950s, and the women who owned it made no apologies for it. It was theirs. It was beautiful. It smelled like powder and gardenia, and the particular version of sophistication that was available to them at their particular price point, and that was exactly enough. At the higher end stood the French imports, and they brought with them the full weight of European prestige packaging. Guerlain's Shalimar arrived in its iconic fan-shaped flacon, an Art Deco design that had been produced since the 1920s, but was updated in the post-war period with refinements to the stopper, a blue and gold confection of glass shaped like a decorative finial that made it simultaneously a perfume vessel and a piece of sculpture. A woman who owned a bottle of Shalimar on her vanity was broadcasting her familiarity with French luxury, her taste for the exotic, her willingness to spend $30 on something that she would consume slowly over a period of months and then replace. Chanel No. 5, in its plain rectangular bottle of clear glass with minimal typography, broadcast a different kind of sophistication entirely, one that was confident enough not to need ornament, that understood simplicity as the ultimate luxury. Both were correct. Both were present on 1950s vanity tables in different households, according to the particular register of elegance that each woman aspired to. The atomizer was a specific subspecies of the perfume bottle that deserved and received devoted attention. A pump atomizer, as opposed to a simple dabber stopper, allowed a woman to mist herself with fragrance rather than applying it directly, which gave a lighter, more diffuse effect and allowed the perfume to settle on hair and fabric as well as skin. The major houses produced their flagship fragrances in both stopper and atomizer versions, and many women owned both. The stopper bottle for display, its presence on the vanity table a permanent aesthetic statement, and a refillable atomizer for actual daily use. The atomizer also existed as an independent decorative object, separate from any particular fragrance. Crystal atomizers with gold or silver metal pump mechanisms, sometimes trimmed with fabric that a woman could fill from whichever bottle she was currently using. These were given as gifts, usually by men who had been advised by the saleswoman at the department store cosmetics counter, and they sat on vanity tables throughout the decade, glinting with a particular kind of ceremonial importance. The arrangement of perfume bottles on the vanity surface was a matter of careful consideration, and women approached it with the same aesthetic attention they brought to the arrangement of the dining table or the living room mantelpiece. Height and scale mattered. A very large bottle, L'Envers Arpège, in its black sphere with gold cap, for instance, needed space around it and should not be crowded. Smaller bottles could be grouped, perhaps 3 or 4 together, creating a cluster that read as a collection rather than a random accumulation. The relationship between the perfume bottles and the other objects on the vanity, the brush and comb set, the powder box, the rouge compact, the lipstick holder, needed to resolve into something that looked intentional, even if the items had been acquired piecemeal over years and from entirely different sources. Some women displayed all their perfume bottles simultaneously, others rotated them seasonally, as one changed the living room drapes or the slipcovers on the sofa. Summer called for light florals and clear glass, something with lily of the valley or fresh green notes, something that looked like water and light. Winter permitted the darker, heavier orientals in jewel-coloured glass, the ambered and musky fragrances that suited wool coats, and the particular indoor closeness of heated rooms. The vanity table tracked the seasons as surely as the wardrobe did. The contemporary perfume, shelfie, the Instagram phenomenon in which perfume collectors photograph their bottle collections arranged on shelves or vanities with deliberate aesthetic care, is the direct descendant of this mid-century arrangement sensibility, and it operates by almost identical logic. The bottles are chosen as much for their visual contribution as for their olfactory character. The arrangement is curated. The display is, in the most fundamental sense, a portrait of the self through the objects with which one chooses to surround oneself. The women of the 1950s understood this intuitively and practiced it daily, without Instagram, without hashtags, but with the same precise and pleasure-seeking attention that their granddaughters would later redirect to a screen. The French perfume houses that established distribution in the American market during the 1950s did so through a system of department store counters that was itself a form of theatre, a stage set for the performance of aspiration. The women behind these counters, trained by the houses in application techniques, product knowledge, and a particular manner of address that was simultaneously respectful and gently superior, occupied a specific position in the social geography of the American department store. They were gatekeepers. A woman who approached the Guerlain counter or the Lanvin counter was entering a negotiation about taste and status, and the counter staff were its referees. The fragrance itself was, of course, the point, but the fragrance was preceded by and accompanied by so much additional cultural material that the experience of buying a French perfume in 1954 was inseparable from all of it. The glass case with its locked interior displaying the bottles on their individual pedestals, the white-gloved hands that removed the selected bottle and placed it on a velvet-covered pad before the customer, the act of sampling on the wrist, with the instruction to wait, to let the perfume warm on the skin, to let the alcohol evaporate, to smell the heart notes rather than the sharp burst of the top notes that hit immediately and then dissipated. This instruction to wait was a lesson in delayed judgment that had implications beyond fragrance. It was teaching a woman to be patient with complexity, to resist the first impression in favour of the more rewarding second and third one. The American perfume industry watched all of this with a mixture of admiration and competitive frustration, and produced its own counter-theatre that was in some ways more sophisticated in its understanding of the American consumer's psychology. Revlon's counter-presentations were lavish with colour. The famous Fire and Ice campaign involved display installations of such chromatic extravagance that the counter itself became a minor spectacle, and emphasized the relationship between the fragrance and the matching cosmetics, the idea of a total look assembled from a single brand's palette. This was an American innovation, the cosmetics brand as lifestyle totality, and it would eventually influence the French houses more than the reverse. But in the early 1950s, the French counter retained its particular aura of European authority, and the bottles that came home from it to the vanity table carried that aura with them, sitting among the domestic American products like distinguished foreign visitors who had conferred their distinction on the neighborhood by choosing to live in it. The refill culture that surrounded the better perfume bottles of the era deserves attention as an indicator of the different relationship to objects that the mid-century period maintained. A cut crystal atomizer was designed to be refilled indefinitely. It was an instrument, not a disposable container. The perfume inside it was the consumable, the bottle was the permanent possession. Women brought their atomizers to the fragrance counter and had them refilled, a transaction that was more intimate than purchasing a sealed bottle, because it required the involvement of the counter staff in what was essentially a maintenance task. The bottle went home again, unchanged, and resumed its place on the vanity table. This relationship to the container as a lasting possession, whose contents were periodically replenished, has almost entirely vanished from contemporary fragrance culture, replaced by the sealed bottle that is retired when empty and replaced by a new purchase. The atomizer as heirloom, as permanent fixture of the vanity landscape, is now the province of collectors. The conversation between French and American fragrance cultures during the 1950s was conducted partly through the pages of the fashion magazines, Vogue and Harper's Bazaar and Mademoiselle, which all maintained Paris bureaus and covered the French couture collections with a reverence that their American readership absorbed as instruction in what sophistication looked like, and partly through the department store counter, where the visual and olfactory contrast between a French import and a domestic product was available to anyone who walked from one counter to the next. The domestic American perfume houses were not without their own sophistication. Estée Lauder, who would eventually produce one of the best-selling fragrances in history in Youth Dew, was in the early 1950s already building a business on the idea that American women deserved luxury products formulated and presented with the same care as European imports, at prices that put them within reach. But the cultural prestige of the French provenance was not entirely matched by product quality alone. It was a matter of story, of history, of the particular glamour that attached to anything arriving from Paris in a decade when Paris still occupied its position as the uncontested capital of feminine style. The vanity table's perfume bottles formed a collection that was, like all collections, simultaneously personal and social. Personal in the specific scents chosen and the memories they carried, social in the brand names displayed and the status those names communicated. A woman who displayed both a French import and a domestic prestige brand alongside a drugstore fragrance was making a statement about pragmatism, about the willingness to judge by quality rather than by label alone. That was itself a form of sophistication. A woman whose collection contained only French imports was making a statement about priorities and means. A woman whose bottles were all domestic was making no explicit statement at all, or rather was making a statement whose subtext depended on whether the bottles were obviously budget products or simply the well-chosen American alternatives of someone who knew exactly what she wanted and where to get it at a fair price. A sterling silver hairbrush weighed somewhere between 8 and 12 ounces, depending on the elaborateness of its back, and this weight was not incidental. It was the point. When a woman lifted a sterling silver brush from the surface of her vanity table in 1952, she felt the authority of it in her hand, the cool solidity, the slight give of the natural bristles against her palm when she pressed them, the sense of holding something that had been made with care and would outlast her. Cheap brushes had light, hollow handles of celluloid or early plastics that felt provisional, temporary, as if they might crack under pressure. A real brush had heft. A real brush was a statement about the permanence of the daily ritual it served. The brush and comb set was among the most culturally loaded objects on the 1950s vanity table. Unlike perfume bottles, which were acquired one at a time as personal choices or received as romantic gifts, the brush and comb set was traditionally a gift given at transitional moments: graduation, engagement, marriage. A complete grooming set, brush, comb, and mirror, all matching, all bearing the same monogram or pattern on their backs, typically arranged in a velvet-lined presentation box, was the gift a mother gave a daughter when the daughter left home, a grandmother gave a granddaughter at a significant birthday, a godparent gave at confirmation. Its receipt marked the passage from girlhood to womanhood, the assumption of adult responsibility over one's own appearance and presentation. The girl received it, took it home, arranged it on her new vanity table, and understood, without anyone having to say so explicitly, that she was now operating a household of the self. The material hierarchy was clear and universally understood. Sterling silver stood at the top, with its cool gleam and its slight tarnishing that required periodic polishing with a soft cloth and silver cream, a maintenance task that was itself part of the ritual, part of the relationship with the object. Silver brush sets came from Tiffany & Company and Gorham and Reed & Barton, and from department store jewellery counters that carried their own house-label silver goods, and they ranged in price from the merely expensive to the genuinely prohibitive. They could be engraved, and usually were, with initials in a script style that matched the formality of the silver's design, and the engraving transformed them from beautiful objects into personal documents, objects that bore the owner's mark as legibly as a signature. Below sterling in the hierarchy, but still firmly in respectable territory, sat silver plate, a base metal, usually brass or white metal, coated with a layer of actual silver thick enough to behave like the real thing for most purposes. Silver plate sets from companies like International Silver or 1847 Rogers Brothers were widely advertised in the middle pages of women's magazines and positioned as the aspirational purchase for women who could not yet afford sterling but intended to behave as though they might. They looked nearly identical to sterling on the vanity table, caught the light in the same way, held the same authoritative weight if the base metal was heavy enough, and tarnished on a similar schedule. Women who owned them knew the difference, and their friends who visited knew the difference if they looked closely enough. But the vanity table was not a jeweller's loop, and the distinction mattered far less in daily practice than it did in principle. Tortoiseshell, or rather, the materials that went by that name, occupied its own corner of the grooming set market. Genuine tortoiseshell, derived from the shell of the hawksbill sea turtle, had been used in decorative combs and brush handles for centuries, and produced a translucent amber and brown material of extraordinary beauty. By the 1950s, international conservation agreements were beginning to restrict its trade, and the major manufacturers were increasingly substituting celluloid acetate, which could be produced in patterns that closely mimicked the original material's variegated amber tones. The distinction between genuine and imitation tortoiseshell was, again, one that the initiated could detect, but that the vanity table rendered largely irrelevant. What mattered was the warm, slightly organic look of the material, the sense it conveyed of natural luxury, of something found and refined rather than manufactured outright. The bristles of the hairbrush were their own category of consideration. Natural boar bristle, derived from the coarse hair of wild boars and processed and graded by stiffness, was the gold standard, and serious women's beauty writing of the period returned to it constantly. Boar bristle brushing was held to stimulate the scalp circulation, distribute the hair's natural oils from root to tip, impart shine, and generally produce those 100 strokes that were the canonical daily prescription for healthy hair. The 100-stroke rule appeared in beauty manuals of the 1950s with the regularity of a commandment. It is not entirely clear where it originated, but it had achieved the status of received truth by mid-century, and would not be seriously challenged until dermatologists in the 1970s began questioning whether vigorous daily brushing might cause more damage than benefit. In 1952, a woman brushed her hair 100 strokes nightly at her vanity table, and she did so with the measured, meditative rhythm of someone performing a cleansing ritual, which is precisely what it was. The comb that accompanied the brush was typically of finer tooth design on one end and wider toothed on the other, allowing it to serve as both a styling tool for precision work and a general detangling implement. The rat tail comb, with its long, thin handle that doubled as a sectioning tool, was a specialized implement used for the pin, curl and roller set processes, and was often kept separately from the decorative set, in a drawer or beside the stack of setting papers, because its function was utilitarian rather than ceremonial. The decorative comb that sat on the vanity surface alongside the brush was for display as much as use, part of the visual grammar of the grooming surface, a companion to the brush that completed the ensemble the way a necktie completes a suit. The matched grooming set persists today in a diminished but recognizable form. The brush and mirror sets sold in department stores and gift shops occupy a smaller cultural space than they once did. Hair care has fragmented into so many specialized tools: the Dyson Airwrap, the wide-tooth shower comb, the boar bristle paddle brush, the Denman brush, the scalp massager, that a single match set cannot claim to address all of the modern ritual's needs. But the impulse that drove the mid-century grooming set, the desire to make the tools of daily care beautiful, to invest them with enough visual weight and material quality that the ritual itself becomes an act of self-regard rather than mere maintenance, that impulse persists. It is visible in the marble-handled brushes sold in lifestyle boutiques today, in the linen-covered brush rolls of the premium travel grooming kit, in the rose-gold-handled comb laid ceremonially on the bathroom shelf. The vanity table's brush still waits, in its many contemporary incarnations, for the morning ritual to begin. The hair care industry and the brush and comb set existed in a relationship of mutual dependency that the vanity table made visible. The products that required the brush, the setting lotion, the brilliantine, the wave preparation, the brilliance cream, were arranged among the grooming tools on the vanity surface with the spatial logic of a craftsman's workbench, each tool adjacent to the material it worked with, the sequence of use determining the sequence of arrangement. The setting lotion sat beside the rat-tail comb with which it was distributed through wet hair before setting. The brilliantine sat beside the brush with which it was worked, through dried, set hair to add gloss and control. The hairnet sat beside the clips, and the clips sat in their dish near the edge of the mirror where they could be reached without looking. The organisation of the vanity surface was a map of the morning routine, and the morning routine was inscribed in the positions of its tools. The hair care companies of the mid-century period understood this landscape with extraordinary precision and marketed their products accordingly. Alberto Culver, which had launched in 1955 with the VO5 conditioning hairdressing, quickly grasped that its product would be judged in part by its vanity presence, by the look of the tube, the feel of it in the hand, the way its chrome cap reflected the vanity lamp's light. The VO5 tube was designed to look medical and scientific, suggesting professional authority, but it was sized and shaped to sit comfortably among the vanity's other inhabitants without disturbing the aesthetic of the surface. This was product design as residential architecture, every element of the tube's exterior considered in relation to its domestic environment. The brush itself aged in ways that made it more personal over time. A new boar bristle brush was stiff, formal, slightly unfamiliar. Used daily for months and years, the bristles softened and took on the specific characteristics of the hair they had been used on. The oils, the texture, the particular density of the brushing pressure applied by this specific woman on this specific head. A brush that had been used for 10 years was, in a very literal sense, customized, shaped to its user in the way that a well-worn shoe is shaped to a foot. This was not considered sentimental excess in the 1950s. It was simply how objects worked when they were properly made and properly cared for. The silver back of the brush was polished periodically with silver cream on a soft cloth. The bristles were cleaned monthly with a brush cleaning comb, or by drawing them through a coarse-toothed comb to remove accumulated hair and product residue, and the brush continued to function and to age and to become, incrementally, more entirely the possession of the woman who used it. The morning brushing ritual was conducted in a specific psychological register that distinguished it from the more technically demanding work of makeup application. Makeup application required concentration, a quality of alert attention to the mirror that engaged the critical faculties and produced the small anxieties of judgment. Is the line even? Is the foundation blended at the jaw? The brushing of the hair was meditative in a different way, repetitive, rhythmic, almost hypnotic in its repetition, the 100 strokes counting themselves out in a cadence that could accommodate thinking, could accommodate the day's mental preparation, could accommodate a certain quality of unfocused mental rest that the morning's other demands did not permit. Women brushed their hair at the vanity table and thought about what they were going to say to their mothers-in-law, about what they were going to cook for the dinner party on Saturday, about the particular quality of the morning light coming through the window, about nothing at all with the practiced ease of people who had learned to use the repetitive task as a container for the mind's wandering. The relationship between the grooming set and the wedding gift tradition was one of the more commercially successful intersections of mid-century retail culture. Department stores maintained dedicated bridal registries by the early 1950s, and the silver-plated brush and comb set was a standard registry item that occupied the moderate price tier. Too inexpensive to be a star gift from a close relative, expensive enough to be a respectable contribution from a more distant one. The registry created a new mechanism for the transmission of grooming sets between women, where once they had been passed down within families, now they were purchased new by networks of friends and colleagues and presented at the bridal shower, or sent to the couple's new address in a box that smelled of the department store's gift wrapping tissue. They arrived monogrammed or ready to be monogrammed, the new initials reflecting the new name, the new life, the new vanity table at which they would begin their decades of use. The care required by sterling silver grooming sets was incorporated into the domestic labour schedule of the women who owned them without particular complaint, because the work was brief and the result was immediate and satisfying. A paste of silver cream on a soft cloth, worked into the ornate pattern of the brush back and then buffed away with a clean section of the cloth, produced a brightness that felt like recovery rather than maintenance. Returning the object to what it had been, preserving it against the dulling the time and air applied to all silver surfaces. The chemical process involved, the silver cream containing a mild abrasive that removed the silver sulfide coating that caused tarnish, was not understood by most of the women who performed it, but the result was understood completely. The brush gleamed, the vanity surface gleamed, the morning could begin. In 1949, Coty released a loose powder called Air Spun in a round cardboard box printed with a pale blue design of dancing figures, and it became one of the best-selling beauty products in American history, a distinction it held for decades and arguably maintains to this day, since Coty continues to produce it in essentially the same formulation and packaging. The success of Air Spun was not entirely explained by its quality, which was genuine but not exceptional. It was explained largely by the container, by the ritual associated with the container, and by the specific domestic space in which that ritual was performed. Air Spun was designed to sit on a vanity table. It was designed to be opened with ceremony, to release a small cloud of fine, talc-based powder when the puff was pressed into it, to be patted across a face already smoothed with liquid foundation, and to produce that particular matte, nearly weightless finish that was the universal beauty goal of the 1950s American woman. The vanity table was Air Spun's natural environment, and Air Spun's success was in part the success of the vanity table as a cultural institution. The relationship between loose face powder and the vanity table was intimate and architectural. Loose powder required a specific infrastructure. the box to hold it, the puff to apply it, the mirror to check the application, and enough clear space on the table surface to set the box down, dip the puff, and work without knocking over the perfume bottles. The pressed powder compact, which could be applied anywhere, at a restaurant table, in a taxi, standing over a friend's bathroom sink, was portable and convenient and enormously popular, but it was not a vanity table object in the same sense. The pressed compact was the powder of the purse. Loose powder in its round box was the powder of home, of the morning ritual, of the deliberate and unhurried preparation that the vanity table made possible. The powder puff was an object of unexpected luxury. The finest puffs of the mid-century period were made of swan's down, the soft, almost impossibly fine belly feathers of swans, which produced a puff so light and so gentle against the skin that women who owned one described the sensation of applying powder with it as something close to being touched by fog. Swan's down puffs were not cheap. They were sold at the better cosmetics counters and in the stationery and gift departments of department stores and at the kind of specialty shops that sold monogrammed items and leather goods, and they arrived in small fabric-covered boxes lined with tissue. Below swan's down in the hierarchy came velour puffs, circular, usually in white or pale pink with a ribbon loop on one side for the fingers, which were entirely adequate and constituted the standard puff supplied with most loose powder boxes. At the bottom of the hierarchy sat the cheap rayon or cotton puffs that came with inexpensive powder brands and were, in the assessment of beauty writers of the era, tolerable but not recommended for serious work. The powder box itself was an object worth considering separately from its contents. A number of firms produced decorative powder boxes meant to house refill powder purchased separately, and these boxes were collected and displayed on vanity tables with the same attention given to perfume bottles. Lentheric and Yardley both produced powder containers of sufficient decorative interest to justify their place on the surface. Some women kept a purely ornamental powder box, perhaps a porcelain piece with a floral design or a silver-lidded container inherited from a grandmother, and transferred their powder into it, decanting from the practical cardboard original into something beautiful. This decanting was a private act of transformation, a small domestic upgrading, the kind of detail that produced satisfaction entirely out of proportion to its actual significance. The application of a loose powder was a technical process that beauty writing of the period documented with the thoroughness of a laboratory protocol. Foundation first, a small amount of liquid or cream foundation, dot applied across the forehead, cheeks, nose and chin, then blended outward from the centre of the face with a damp cosmetic sponge or the fingers, working down the jaw and, crucially, across the neck and the top of the chest if the neckline was low enough to make the difference visible. Wait for the foundation to set, perhaps 30 seconds, perhaps a minute. Then, the powder puff, loaded with enough loose powder to look slightly alarming, pressed into the face rather than swept across it. The pressing motion was important. Sweat powder disturbed the foundation beneath it, until the entire surface of the skin was uniformly matte, and the foundation had been set, fixed, rendered as permanent as cosmetics in the 1950s could manage. Then the removal of the excess, which was performed with a brush. The large soft powder brush was a vanity table tool as essential as the puff itself, swept lightly across the face in downward strokes that followed the direction of the facial hair, and removed the loose surplus while leaving behind an even fine layer. The result, if the process had been correctly executed, was a face that appeared to have no texture at all, no pores, no irregularities, a kind of matte perfection that the era's photography both demanded and celebrated, since the high contrast black and white film of the period and the flashbulb photography of newspaper and magazine work required a face that absorbed rather than reflected light. The matte finish was not merely a fashion preference, it was a technical solution to a photographic problem, and it persisted long after photographic technology had advanced beyond the need for it. The powder bloom, that fine, barely visible haze of powder that settled onto the surface of the vanity table regardless of a woman's care, drifting from the puff or lifting from the box when the lid was removed, was one of the characteristic atmospheres of the mid-century dressing table. It settled on the wooden surface, on the lids of nearby compacts, in the grooves of the silver brush handles, on the stopper of the perfume bottle. It had a texture when you ran your finger across it, and a smell, faintly talcy, faintly floral, faintly chemical, that was itself one of the olfactory signatures of the era. Women dusted the vanity table periodically with a soft cloth, but the bloom returned immediately and was in the end simply accepted as part of the atmosphere of the space, the way flour dust is accepted as part of a kitchen's character. The vanity table smelled of powder because that was what a vanity table smelled like, and the women who sat at them every morning breathed it in without remark. Today's setting powders, the translucent pressed powders, the loose-milled luxury powders sold in heavy glass jars at department store counters, the influencer beloved brands that promise the same matte lock-in that Coty Air Spun delivered in 1949, perform the same function and serve the same purpose as their mid-century predecessors, with updated chemistry that allows for lighter coverage and better compatibility with the high-definition cameras that have replaced the flash photography of the 1950s as the standard of appearance against which a finished face is measured. The puff is still there. The ritual of pressing is still there. The small cloud of powder that lifts when the lid is opened is still there. Only the vanity table that holds the box has sometimes been replaced by a bathroom shelf or a portable organizer, but the impulse to fix the face, to set it, to make it last the length of whatever comes next, is as unchanged as the smell of talc in the morning air. The talc trade that underpinned the loose powder industry was a global supply chain of considerable complexity, and the cosmetics companies of the 1950s maintained exacting specifications for the talc they used in their face powders because the quality of the raw material determined nearly everything about the quality of the finished product. The finest cosmetic talc came from specific mining regions, parts of Vermont and Montana in the United States, certain Italian deposits that the French perfume houses had been using since the 19th century. And it was graded by particle size with a precision that made the grading of cooking flour seem approximate. The smallest particle size, called impalpable or superimpalpable, depending on the manufacturer's nomenclature, produced a powder that could barely be felt on the skin, that appeared to dematerialize on contact with the face rather than lying on top of it. This was the grade used by the premium brands. The mid-range and economy products used slightly coarser grades that were still perfectly adequate for their purpose, but produced a finish with faintly more visible texture. The addition of colour to the powder was an art that cosmetic chemists of the period practiced with considerable skill, because the pigments used to tint face powder had to meet several competing requirements simultaneously. They had to match the wide range of skin tones the product was formulated for. A single shade of face powder was expected to work across perhaps 2 or 3 adjacent shades of foundation, and the pigment loading had to be precisely calibrated so that the powder did not noticeably alter the colour of the foundation applied beneath it. They had to be stable, meaning they could not change colour under the influence of perspiration or body heat, or the natural oils of the skin. And they had to be safe, which in the regulatory environment of the 1950s was a somewhat more relaxed standard than it would later become. The FDA's authority over cosmetic safety had been established by the Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act of 1938, but its enforcement resources were limited and the industry's self-regulation was uneven. The fragrance of face powder was another carefully calibrated element, and one that was perhaps more important to the powder's commercial success than its technical performance. A powder that performed excellently but smelled wrong would not sell. A powder with a beautiful, distinctive fragrance could succeed in the market even if its coverage was merely adequate. Coty's Air Spun smelled of a particular light floral accord, a blend of iris and violet with some rose and a faint musky warmth at the base, that was so closely identified with the product that women who used it during the 50s recognized the smell instantly for the rest of their lives and reported the recognition with the force of involuntary memory, the smell carrying with it the complete sensory context of the vanity table, the morning light, the ritual beginning of the day. This is the particular power of olfactory memory, which operates by different neural pathways than visual or auditory memory, and consequently can produce recall of unusual vividness and physical immediacy. The smell of Coty Air Spun was, for a generation of American women, the smell of beginning. The compact powder that accompanied women into the world was, as mentioned, a different object with a different function, but it maintained an essential relationship with the loose powder on the vanity table, because the two had to match. A woman who used a medium coverage liquid foundation at home and set it with a loose powder in a warm ivory tone needed a pressed compact in a shade close enough to that warm ivory that touching up at the restaurant would not produce a visible difference between the freshly applied area and the surrounding makeup. This matching was not always easy to achieve, partly because loose powders and pressed powders in the same nominal shade could appear different in use. The texture was different, the compression changed the light interaction, the binders used in pressed compacts could slightly alter the colour's apparent temperature. Women developed their own solutions to this problem through trial and error, keeping notes sometimes, discussing it with the cosmetics counterstaff, who were often more knowledgeable about these technical questions than the brand's advertising suggested. The powder room, that curious American institution, the half-bathroom devoted to face freshening rather than bathing, typically located near the front of a suburban house where guests would use it, contained its own miniature version of the vanity table's powder infrastructure. A small compact mirror above the sink, a bar of guest soap, a hand towel so perfectly pressed it seemed almost too good to use, and, in the best appointed powder rooms, a small supply of face powder in a presentation dish, or a pressed compact left deliberately for guests' use, or simply a clear surface near the mirror on which a guest might set her own purse compact for the brief ritual of appearance, checking that the powder room was designed to accommodate. The name itself declared its purpose. This was the room where powder was applied, where the face was refreshed, where the public presentation was checked and adjusted before returning to the social performance of the party. The powder puff as a gift object, separate from the powder, sold alone in its own small presentation box, sometimes given as a hostess gift or a birthday present, occupied an interesting commercial niche that reflected the period's comfort with beauty rituals as shared social territory between women. A beautiful powder puff in swan's down or in the finest velour conveyed an understanding of the recipient's daily practices and an appreciation for the quality of her toilette. It said, in effect, "I know that you use a powder puff every morning, and I know that a beautiful one is better than a merely adequate one, and I have chosen to give you the beautiful one because I think you deserve it, and because it will sit on your vanity table, and you will think of me each time you use it." Gifts of this specificity required the giver to know the recipient well, to know her vanity table habits, her colour preferences, her existing puff quality, and their successful execution was a social accomplishment as well as a commercial transaction. A woman who owned more than 4 lipsticks in 1953 was in possession of a collection, and collections required organisation. This was not a frivolous observation. It was a practical one. The cylindrical metal lipstick bullet, typically 2 3/4 inches tall, perhaps 3/4 of an inch in diameter, finished in brushed gold or silver or lacquered in a colour that coordinated with the shade inside, was not a stable object. Left loose on the vanity table, lipstick bullets rolled. They rolled toward the edge of the surface with the quiet persistence of objects determined to fall. They congregated under the mirror rail or disappeared behind the perfume bottles. They were found weeks later in unlikely places. The solution to this problem of rolling lipstick had been recognized by the cosmetics industry almost immediately, and by the early 1950s a small but thriving sub-industry had emerged around the lipstick holder, that cylindrical or carousel-style device, usually of metal or acrylic, designed to hold lipstick bullets upright, displayed and accessible, in a formation that was as decorative as it was functional. The lipstick holder is one of the unsung heroes of mid-century vanity design. Unlike the perfume bottle or the powder box, which have received considerable scholarly and collector attention in recent decades, the lipstick holder has been largely overlooked, perhaps because its function was so completely mundane. It held things in place, and its form was correspondingly unpretentious. But the better lipstick holders of the 1950s were not unpretentious at all. They were made of sterling silver, or of gilded brass, or of enamel over metal, sometimes in carousel formations that rotated on a central post, so that a woman could spin through her collection and select the day's shade with the pleasant inefficiency of someone browsing a particularly small but well-curated library. Some lipstick holders were designed to hold 4 bullets, some 6, some 12, and the size of a woman's holder told a visitor, and the woman herself, something about the scale of her commitment to the daily practice of lip colour. The shades themselves deserved the display they received. Revlon's colour names during this period were among the most brilliant feats of product naming in the history of marketing, and they were meant to be seen and read and repeated aloud. Fire and Ice, launched in 1952, was accompanied by an advertising campaign of such calculated audacity, a quiz in the magazine advertisement that asked women whether they were bold enough to wear the shade, that it became one of the decade's most successful product launches and essentially defined the aspirational self-image of the American woman of the era. Sophisticated, slightly dangerous, in control of her own desires. The name appeared on the bottom of the tube in raised lettering, so that when a lipstick bullet sat in its holder, a woman could see which shade was which without having to uncap each one. The names were part of the point. Persian Melon, Bachelor's Carnation, Stormy Weather, Love That Pink. Coty offered Paris Rose and Rose Dorée. Helena Rubinstein catalogued her shades with a rigour that bordered on the clinical, naming them with reference to their undertone characteristics. Each name was a promise, a small piece of storytelling compressed into 2 or 3 words, and the collection of names displayed in a carousel holder on the vanity table was its own kind of lyric. The construction of the lipstick bullet itself was by mid-century a triumph of industrial design. The case was 2-piece, a sleeve, which provided the exterior surface and the finger and thumb grip, and an inner mechanism that raised the bullet of colour when the base was twisted counterclockwise and retracted it when twisted clockwise. The earliest lipstick cases of the 1930s and 40s had been cruder mechanisms, prone to sticking or to releasing the bullet suddenly and completely. By 1950, the major manufacturers had refined the twist-up mechanism to something close to perfection, a smooth, precise, satisfying engagement of gears that raised the colour at exactly the right speed, neither too fast nor too slow. The sound of a lipstick case being opened, a small, definite click as the 2 halves connected, and the subsequent twist that produced the bullet of colour was one of the sonic signatures of the era, a sound as recognisable and as laden with anticipatory pleasure as the pop of a champagne cork. The ritual of lipstick application at the vanity table was a specific and practised act. The bullet was raised. The woman leaned forward slightly toward the triptych mirror, bringing her face within 8 to 10 inches of the central panel. She held the case as one might hold a pen between thumb and forefinger, with the arm of the hand resting lightly on the edge of the vanity table to stabilise the movement. She drew the bullet along the natural line of the upper lip, following the bow with a single smooth stroke from the centre outward, then repeated the motion on the other side. The lower lip was applied more generously, since the lower lip required more coverage and a slightly less precise outline. Then the blot, a single piece of tissue folded once, pressed between the lips for 2 seconds, removing the excess and setting the colour. Then a second, slightly lighter application over the blot, producing the double-layered finish that was supposed to last through lunch and perform adequately through the afternoon. Hazel Bishop, whose No Smear lipstick launched in 1950 and transformed the market by delivering on the promise its name made, deserves particular mention in any account of mid-century lip colour. Before Hazel Bishop, lipstick transferred onto everything: cups, cigarette filters, cheeks after a kiss, the collars of shirts, with a promiscuity that was, from a practical standpoint, exhausting to manage. No Smear used a film-forming resin that bonded more aggressively to the lip surface and resisted the moisture and abrasion that caused ordinary lipstick to migrate. It was not perfectly non-transferring. Nothing in 1950 was, but it was demonstrably more stable than what preceded it, and women bought it in enormous quantities. By 1952, Hazel Bishop Inc. was generating over $10 million in annual revenue, up from a starting point of $50,000 just 2 years earlier, making it one of the fastest commercial expansions in the history of American cosmetics. The lipstick collection on today's Vanity or makeup shelf participates in the same logic as its mid-century predecessor, though the range of finishes — gloss, liquid, matte, satin, sheer, metallic, velvet — has multiplied to a degree that 1953 could not have anticipated. The colour names still do their lyrical work. Charlotte Tilbury names her shades after women: Penelope Pink, Pillow Talk. MAC reaches for music and art and emotion. Pat McGrath pursues the poetic and the deliberately excessive. The Carousel lipstick holder has returned as a contemporary organising tool, sold in acrylic rather than gilded brass, but serving the identical function it served 70 years ago. And the ritual at the mirror — lean in, draw the line, blot on a tissue that bears the ghost of the colour — is as unchanged as the shape of a lip. The lipstick's cultural weight during the 1950s was not limited to its chromatic properties or its cosmetic function. It carried the history of wartime with it in ways that the women who wore it in 1954 could not entirely have articulated, but would have recognised if it had been pointed out. During the Second World War, lipstick had been one of the few cosmetics that the United States government had declined to classify as a luxury item, and therefore declined to restrict in its production. The symbolic reasoning was partly practical. Maintaining female morale on the home front was understood as a genuine war effort, and partly political, since the contrast between the lip-coloured American woman and the deliberately defeminized woman of German fascist ideology had genuine propaganda value. Hitler's Germany had officially disapproved of cosmetics as decadent and un-Germanic. American propaganda was delighted to associate democracy with the freedom to wear lipstick, and it did so with a cheerful explicitness that in retrospect seems almost comically forthright. The post-war lipstick was therefore loaded with the meanings of that wartime context, even when it was being applied at a vanity table in a peaceful suburb with no more pressing concern than a Tuesday luncheon. It was simultaneously a beauty product, a consumer good available to women who had just watched their country emerge victorious from a world war, and a small domestic symbol of a certain kind of freedom. The freedom to present oneself as one chose, to use colour as a tool of self-expression, to participate in a commercial culture of personal appearance that the war years had briefly threatened and then spectacularly restored. When Revlon named its 1952 shade Fire and Ice and asked in its advertising whether American women were bold enough to wear it, the boldness in question was not abstract. It was the boldness of claiming pleasure, of claiming visibility, of claiming the right to use colour as statement rather than merely as decoration. The application technique for lipstick was the subject of more editorial attention in the beauty writing of the period than almost any other single cosmetic technique, which suggests both its importance and its genuine difficulty. The difficulty was not in the basic application. Pressing a bullet of pigmented wax along the lip surface was, mechanically, not complicated, but in the precision and the longevity of the results. The natural lip line, which in the 1950s was generally followed rather than redrawn — overdrawn or underdrawn lips would not become a common technique until later decades — was a complex curve whose peaks and valleys required the brush or the bullet to follow it with a steadiness that was partly anatomical, the steadiness of the hand, the control of the wrist, and partly optical, reading the mirror image accurately and translating that reading into physical movement. Women who drew their lip outline with a wooden lip brush rather than the bullet directly had the advantage of a finer tool, but the additional challenge of keeping the brush loaded enough to produce a continuous line without flooding the brush to the point of bleeding. The blot, the folded tissue pressed between the lips after the first application, was a technical step that was also a small ritual of patience. It required waiting the brief, specific moment between application and blotting that allowed the colour to adhere without the blot simply removing it entirely. It produced a faint, powdery, matte initial result that became, after the second application over it, a deep, true, lasting colour. Women who skipped the blot in the interest of time found that their lipstick moved more readily through the morning, feathering into the fine lines above the upper lip, or transferring onto their coffee cup in a way that declared the lipstick's lack of staying power as clearly as if the cup had worn a sign. The blot was not optional. The blot was the investment that made the rest of the ritual pay its dividend. The cultural narrative around lipstick and feminism was not, in 1954, a narrative that most American women were actively constructing. The vocabulary and the political framework for understanding cosmetics as a social constraint rather than a personal choice had not yet been assembled into anything coherent enough to circulate widely. But the conversations that Betty Friedan would synthesize into the feminine mystique in 1963 were already happening in the 1950s, in letters and in the remarks women made to each other at the vanity table, or in the kitchen, or at the suburban coffee clatch that was itself a subject of considerable ambivalence in the decade's domestic fiction. Some women found the ritual of makeup application genuinely pleasurable, a daily practice of creativity and self-expression that gave the morning's first half hour a quality of private satisfaction. Other women found it a tax levied on their time by social expectations they had not chosen. Most women occupied some complicated middle territory, enjoying some aspects of the ritual and resenting others, aware that opting out entirely was not really available to them in most social contexts, but uncertain whether the opting in was entirely free. The lipstick on the vanity table was simultaneously a product of this social arrangement and a tool within it, one of the instruments by which the arrangement was maintained, applied daily at the mirror with a compliance that was both chosen and required. It is worth holding both of these things at once. The genuine pleasure that many women took in the specific act of choosing a colour and applying it with skill, and the genuine constraint that made the choice not quite free. The vanity table was where this tension was negotiated daily and without resolution, by women who were doing the best they could with the circumstances they inhabited. The lipstick was real. The pleasure was real. The constraint was also real. None of these facts cancels the others. The bottles were small, typically half a fluid ounce or 15 millilitres, which sounds like nothing until you consider that this volume was sufficient to perform several full manicures, that the bottle would sit on the vanity table for months and perhaps years before being exhausted, and that the bottle's visual contribution to the vanity surface was entirely out of proportion to its physical dimensions. A collection of nail enamel bottles arranged at the edge of the vanity table in 1954 was a colour portfolio, a statement of range, a documentation of mood preferences, and a small private art installation, all simultaneously. Revlon understood this with particular clarity, which is why the Revlon bottle, that distinctive squared-off shape in clear glass with the red cap and the rectangular label, printed with the shade name in bold type, was designed to look as good in a collection as it looked in isolation. Revlon bottles were meant to be displayed, and the women who bought them displayed them. The question of which shades to own was a seasonal and situational one that beauty editors of the period addressed with the seriousness of editorial directors planning a couture issue. The baseline collection was broadly agreed upon, a classic red for evening and formality, something in the coral to melon range for daytime and summer, a pale pink for moments when the hands needed to be present without calling attention to themselves, perhaps a deeper rose for autumn and winter. Beyond this foundation, individual taste asserted itself, and Revlon's extraordinary colour range. The company introduced new shades at a pace that seemed almost aggressive in retrospect, releasing seasonal collections with coordinated lipstick companions and advertising campaigns of operatic ambition, ensured that the committed consumer always had reasons to expand. The matched set concept, which Revlon had pioneered and which the rest of the industry scrambled to replicate, was one of the great marketing inventions of the mid-century cosmetics industry. The idea was simple, that a woman's lips and nails should match, not merely harmonise, not merely occupy the same general territory of the colour wheel, but genuinely precisely match, as if they had been calibrated to each other by a chromatic expert. Revlon formulated its nail enamel and lipstick in coordinated pairs, sold them together in gift sets and advertised them side by side, and produced a visual standard. The woman photographed from the chin down, one hand raised to frame a bright and perfectly matched lip, the nails a precise echo of the lip colour, that became one of the defining aesthetic images of the era. The vanity table was where this coordination was verified. A woman choosing her outfit for an event would stand or sit at her vanity table, hold the lipstick bullet in one hand and the nail enamel bottle in the other, and compare the two against each other in the mirror's light. She was checking for undertone alignment, whether both were warm reds or cool reds, whether the coral in the lip colour matched the coral in the nail, and she was checking for intensity, since a very deep lip required a nail of equivalent depth to avoid the effect of the colour fighting. This was a skill developed over time, a kind of colour literacy that the major cosmetics companies both required and rewarded by producing paired products that made the task straightforward. The application of nail enamel at the vanity table was a separate ritual from the face, performed usually at a different time, often in the late afternoon before an event, or on a Sunday morning as a weekly maintenance task, and requiring its own infrastructure. A bottle of nail enamel remover, typically acetone or ethyl acetate based, in a glass or plastic bottle with a cotton ball wedged under the cap or kept beside it. An orangewood stick for clean-up at the cuticle, a nail file, usually emery board for regular use, and sometimes a finer sapphire or glass file for smoothing. The bottle of enamel itself was warmed slightly in the hands before opening. Cold enamel applied more thickly and was more likely to streak, and opened with a specific twist of the wrist that, in a well-maintained bottle, produced a brush that emerged loaded with exactly the right amount of colour. Too much, and the enamel pooled at the cuticle and smeared onto the skin. Too little, and the stroke went dry before it reached the free edge. 3 strokes per nail was the canonical application method. 1 down the centre, 1 on the left side, 1 on the right, with each stroke drawn from as close to the cuticle as possible, without actually touching it. This was more difficult than it sounds. The cuticle margin was perhaps a millimetre of clear skin, and the brush had to approach it without crossing it, because enamel on the cuticle was an immediate visual failure that required either removal with the orangewood stick, which disturbed the wet stroke and risked smearing, or the entire process being started again with remover. Women who had been doing their nails every week for years moved through the 3-stroke process with a speed and assurance that looked effortless and was the product of 10,000 repetitions. Women who were less experienced took longer and produced results that were identifiably less precise. The drying time was a constraint that organised the remainder of the evening's preparations. A first coat of nail enamel required between 5 and 10 minutes to dry to the point where it could receive a second coat without lifting or wrinkling. A second coat dried in a similar period. The top coat, a clear overcoat applied to protect the colour and add shine, which Revlon and other major brands produced specifically for this purpose, required another 5 to 10 minutes. This meant that the full manicure from first stroke to functional nails consumed approximately 30 to 45 minutes of active waiting time, during which the hands had to be kept still and away from anything that might disturb the drying surface. Some women read during this period, holding the book with their fingertips. Some watched the early television programs that had begun appearing in living rooms during this period. Some simply sat at the vanity table with their hands spread flat on its surface, watching the colour deepen and set, thinking whatever it is women think when they're waiting for nail enamel to dry. The contemporary nail enamel collection, whether displayed in acrylic organisers on a vanity shelf, stored in a drawer of a professional rolling cart, or arranged in that particular Instagram flat lay formation of bottles tilted at identical angles against a neutral background, is the direct heir of the mid-century collection arranged at the vanity table's edge. The bottle proportions and materials have changed somewhat. Quick-dry formulas have compressed the waiting period. Gel systems have eliminated it entirely. But the colour collection, the matched lip and nail logic, the seasonal rotation, the specific pleasure of surveying one's shades and selecting the appropriate one for the day ahead, all of this persists as recognisably continuous with what a woman in 1954 was doing at her vanity table on a Sunday morning, when the house was quiet and the light was good, and the orange cup of tea was at her elbow and her nails needed attending to. The question of shade selection from a collection of nail enamel was itself a form of decision-making that beauty writers occasionally elevated to the level of personal philosophy. To know which shade to choose required self-knowledge, knowledge of one's colouring, yes, but also knowledge of one's social schedule, one's professional context, one's mood, and the specific chromatic demands of the wardrobe items with which the nails would be seen. A woman whose nails would be visible above a white tablecloth at a formal dinner party needed to think about how the shade would read against white linen at candlelight, a very different calculation from how it read under the fluorescent light of the office or the daylight of the garden party. The nail enamel collection on the vanity table was a toolkit for navigating these variable contexts, and the woman who maintained a thoughtfully curated collection of perhaps 8 to 12 shades had, in effect, prepared herself to respond appropriately to a wide range of social situations through the small but visible instrument of her fingertips. The drying vigil, those 20 to 30 minutes during which wet nail enamel demanded stillness and gentle breath-holding, was so embedded in the domestic culture of the period that it generated its own body of humour and practical advice. Beauty magazines published activities you can do while your nails dry, features that were distinguished by their narrowness. Essentially, reading, if the book could be managed with fingertip contact at the edges, watching television, or sitting quietly in the thoughtful pose of someone who has temporarily suspended all activity requiring the use of the hands. The list of what you could not do during nail drying was considerably longer and considerably more entertaining. You could not answer the telephone, which in 1955 still required a receiver that was picked up. You could not open the refrigerator. You could not adjust your stocking seams. You could not pet the dog. You could not cut anything, or turn a doorknob, or rifle through a handbag, or perform any of the 100 small manual tasks that constituted normal domestic life. Nail drying time was therefore the most effectively enforced rest period in the working week of the American housewife, and some women reported that they found it perversely valuable for this reason. The professional manicure as an alternative or supplement to the home ritual occupied an interesting position in the economics of mid-century feminine self-care. A salon manicure in 1953 cost approximately $1.50 in the average American city, which was not insignificant but was not prohibitive for women in households with a comfortable income. The salon manicurist worked with a speed and precision that the home manicurist typically could not match. The professional application was cleaner at the cuticle margin, more even in coverage, more reliably symmetrical across all 10 nails, and the drying time was managed more efficiently in the salon than at home, partly because professional nail lamps had begun appearing in salons by the early 1950s, accelerating the process that at home required patient waiting. But the salon manicure had a significant disadvantage for the women who valued the vanity table ritual. It removed the act of manicure from the domestic space entirely, taking it out of the vanity's orbit and placing it in a commercial environment. The women who found the weekly home manicure not merely a maintenance task but a genuine ritual of self-attention often preferred the home version for exactly this reason, even accepting its inferior technical results as the price of privacy. The nail enamel remover ritual, the cotton ball soaked in acetone, the careful swipe across each nail, was the undoing that preceded the remaking, and it had its own sensory character as distinct as the application that followed it. Acetone smelled clean and sharp and very slightly medicated, cutting through the previous week's enamel with a chemical efficiency that left the nail bed briefly white and slightly chalky before the natural colour and moisture returned. Women who performed this ritual weekly developed a relationship with the smell that was neither pleasant nor unpleasant, but entirely specific, associated with the beginning of the manicure ritual as completely as coffee smell is associated with the beginning of the morning. The smell of acetone meant that the nails were about to be renewed. It meant the week was turning over. It meant Sunday, or the afternoon before the party, or the quiet hour when the house was still enough to sit and do this properly. The industry of nail care accessories that surrounded the enamel and the remover was a small but perfectly coherent commercial ecosystem. The orange stick, technically the dried stem of the orange tree, which had just enough flexibility and just enough hardness for the gentle work of pushing back the cuticle and cleaning under the free edge, was sold in bundles and used casually and discarded without sentiment. The emery board, with its 2 graduated grits of abrasive paper on a cardboard core, was the standard filing tool, available everywhere, and priced to be replaced rather than maintained. The cuticle nipper, the steel implement with its spring-loaded hinge and its precisely aligned cutting edges, was the one tool in the manicure kit that was made to last. A good nipper could be resharpened and would serve for years, and the women who owned good nippers were distinguished from the women who owned cheap ones by the cleanness and precision of the cuticle work they produced. The vanity table held all of these things, organised into whatever system the individual woman had developed, and the system was always specific to her. The tool drawer arrangement, the placing of the remover bottle relative to the cotton ball box relative to the enamel collection, as personal and as unreplicable as a signature. The worst possible light in which to apply foundation in 1952 was overhead light from a single ceiling fixture. Beauty writers of the era made this point so consistently and with such evident exasperation, as if they could not believe they had to say it again, that it clearly was not being heeded. Overhead light cast shadows downward across the face, creating a hollowness beneath the cheekbones and a darkness under the brows, and a general impression of gauntness that bore no relationship to how the face looked in the horizontal, forward-directed light of the world in which other people actually encountered it. A woman who applied her foundation in overhead light and then went to meet her friends for lunch was making her corrections to a face that did not exist outside her bathroom. She was fixing shadows that would not accompany her. She was compensating for problems that were artifacts of the light source rather than features of her actual face. The vanity lamp was the solution to this problem, and the better vanity table designs of the mid-century period incorporated it from the start. The ideal vanity lamp provided light from the front and slightly above, mimicking the quality of daylight falling on a face from an open window or a partly overcast sky, even diffuse, revealing the true colour of the skin and the actual depth of shadow under the eyes, without creating artificial darknesses or flattening the face into a uniform plane. Theatrical dressing rooms had understood this for generations. The ring of bare bulbs that surrounded the dressing room mirror, and that remain the universal symbol of performer preparation, were designed precisely to eliminate shadow by providing light from all directions simultaneously. And the better vanity mirror manufacturers of the 1950s attempted to approximate this theatrical standard for the domestic setting. Some vanity tables came with built-in mirror lighting, a strip of frosted glass tubing above the central mirror panel, or a pair of swing-arm sconces mounted to either side of the mirror, or a single architectural bar of incandescent bulbs running across the top edge. These built-in solutions varied considerably in their effectiveness, and the furniture manufacturer's priority was aesthetic coherence rather than cosmetic utility, which meant that the lighting provided was often better looking than performing. The frosted tube above the mirror was elegant. It also produced a soft, diffuse light that flattered the face, but concealed the texture problems, the dry skin patches, the uneven pigmentation, the fine lines beginning to appear at the corners of the eyes, that a woman was specifically trying to address with her foundation and powder application. The freestanding vanity lamp was the preferred professional solution, and the cosmetics industry promoted it with a specificity that furniture advertising rarely matched. A vanity lamp should sit at face level, not above it. Its shade should direct light forward rather than downward. It should be positioned to the side of the mirror rather than above it, to provide three-dimensional modelling light rather than flat frontal illumination. Some beauty writers specified the wattage. 100 watts was the standard recommendation, which in 1952 meant the standard incandescent bulb burning at full brightness, producing a light that was warm in colour temperature, more orange than the natural daylight it was supposed to approximate, but brighter than most overhead fixtures and considerably better than nothing. The lamp itself was an aesthetic object, whose place on the vanity surface was as considered as the perfume bottle or the powder box. Ceramic base lamps in pale pink or ivory with pleated silk shades in white or cream were a standard domestic option, sized to sit comfortably at the end of the vanity table without overwhelming the other objects. The shade colour mattered. A pink shade warmed the light and produced a flattering glow, but was professionally advised against on the grounds that it would conceal the natural colour of foundation and produce an application that appeared perfectly matched under pink light, but conspicuously orange under the daylight of the outside world. A white or cream shade was technically superior but aesthetically cooler, less immediately flattering, which was precisely why it was more honest and therefore more useful. The question of a light colour temperature, what we now call Kelvin rating, was not described in those terms by the beauty writers of the period, who lacked the vocabulary but entirely grasped the concept. The problem they were articulating when they warned against the orange warmth of tungsten light and the excessive coolness of fluorescent light was exactly the problem of colour temperature. That light sources differ in their spectral content, and that this difference changes the apparent colour of everything illuminated by them. A blue-red lipstick that looked perfectly calibrated under warm tungsten light appeared startlingly blue-toned under the cool greenish light of a fluorescent tube. A foundation that matched the skin in the daylight of the department store might be visibly too pink in the tungsten warmth of the vanity lamp. Women navigated these variables empirically, developing over years of experimentation a compensatory intelligence about how their makeup would translate from the vanity to the world. They learned that a foundation shade that looked very slightly too light under the vanity lamp's warmth would be correct in daylight. They learned that a lipstick that appeared a clean, true red under tungsten light was probably pulling slightly orange and should be replaced with something cooler if the look was to read as red under noon sun. They developed, without anyone having named it for them, a kind of chromatic anticipation, an ability to visualize the transformation that different light sources would perform on the colors they applied in their bedroom. The LED vanity mirror and the ring light that dominate contemporary makeup preparation spaces address this historical problem with technological means that the 1950s vanity lamp could not have anticipated. The adjustable color temperature dial that allows a woman to switch between warm tungsten simulation and cool daylight simulation, checking her foundation at 5000 Kelvin before committing to it, would have been recognized immediately as a solution to the exact problem that beauty writers of 1953 were complaining about in their columns. The ring light's shadow-eliminating geometry is a direct evolution of the theatrical dressing room principle that the vanity lamp was always trying to approximate. The technology is entirely different, the problem is identical, and the woman leaning toward the mirror in the good light, checking that the colour is true, is participating in the same ritual that her grandmother performed at the vanity table in the pale, warm glow of a ceramic lamp on a cold morning in 1953. The switch from incandescent lighting to fluorescent lighting in domestic spaces was a minor but genuinely consequential event in the history of mid-century feminine self-presentation, and it played out first in the spaces that were illuminated not by choice but by default: the workplace, the department store, the office building where artificial light of the cooler, more efficient fluorescent variety was installed throughout the building as a cost measure. Women who applied their makeup in the warm tungsten glow of the vanity lamp, and then spent their working day under the cool greenish cast of fluorescent tubes sometimes encountered in the glass doors of their office building's lobby or in the mirror of the ladies' room, a version of their face that seemed to have been translated into a slightly different colour space. The foundation was the same colour, the fluorescent light was not. The effect was described in beauty writing of the period as making makeup look flat, or ashy, or simply off. Terms that were attempting to describe the chromatic displacement produced by the different spectral content of the light source. The cosmetics industry responded to this problem with a mixture of genuine technical innovation and strategic positioning. Some companies began experimenting with foundation formulations that included small amounts of light-diffusing particles, mica mostly, which had been used in cosmetics since ancient times, and which had the property of scattering light at multiple angles, giving the skin surface a softer, less flat appearance under the harsh directionality of artificial light. Others simply emphasized the importance of choosing the right shade, arguing that the flatness of fluorescent lighting was not a property of the light, but a consequence of choosing a foundation shade with too much pink in it. A warmer, more golden foundation read as skin under fluorescent light, where a cooler, pinkier shade read as makeup. This was, as practical advice goes, broadly accurate, and it informed the foundation shade consultation practices of the better department store cosmetics counters throughout the decade. The vanity lamp as a technical problem was addressed more directly by a small number of manufacturers who began producing specialized cosmetics lighting in the mid-1950s. These were not yet the full-spectrum daylight bulbs that would appear in later decades, but they represented a genuine attempt to move beyond the standard tungsten bulb and towards something that approximated the broad spectral range of natural daylight. The results were imperfect. Colour temperature calibration at an affordable price point for the consumer market was not yet achievable. But the attempt itself signalled an understanding that the lighting of the vanity surface was a technical matter, with real consequences for the quality of makeup application, and therefore for the appearance of the woman who sat at it. The furniture was one thing, the light was another, and the relationship between them was the condition of everything else. The concept of lighting for makeup has become, in the contemporary world, a sophisticated field with its own technical vocabulary and commercial infrastructure. The Kelvin rating appears on consumer packaging. YouTube tutorials specify the colour temperature of their ring lights with the precision of film technicians. Lighted vanity mirrors available at a range of price points offer adjustable colour temperature as a standard feature rather than a luxury add-on. The problem being solved is the same problem that the beauty editor of the 1953 issue of Harper's Bazaar was attempting to describe when she wrote that women should always apply makeup in the light in which they will be seen, a piece of advice so fundamentally correct that it remains current practice, unchanged in its logic by the intervening 70 years of technological development. The mirror within the vanity lamp's functional orbit, the hand mirror that was kept on the vanity surface or in the top drawer, distinct from the fixed triptych mirror, served as a mobile extension of the reflection infrastructure. It was the tool for checking the back of the hair after the fixed mirror had been used for the front. It was the instrument for examining a blemish at close range that the larger mirror showed only from a distance. It was carried to different locations in the room to check the appearance of the hair and face in different light conditions. Some hand mirrors were matched to the brush and comb set in material and design. Others were purely utilitarian. The best ones had a magnifying side, typically 2 times or 3 times magnification. that reveal the texture of the foundation at a scale impossible to assess in a standard mirror, showing whether the coverage was truly even, or whether the blending had left visible edges, or whether the powder had caught in the fine lines around the eyes in the way that required the application of less powder rather than more. The magnifying mirror was a genuinely double-edged instrument, and women who used it regularly developed a complicated relationship with what it showed. At 2 times magnification, the normal surface of a human face revealed itself as a terrain of remarkable variety, pores of varying sizes, the fine hairs that were ordinarily invisible, the slight differences in skin texture between the T-zone and the cheek area, the network of fine lines that were beginning to appear, and that standard distance obscured. The women of the 1950s were told by beauty writing of the period to use magnification for specific purposes, checking mascara application, ensuring foundation blending at the jaw, but not to use it for general self-assessment, because the standard of perfection that magnification implied was not the standard by which anyone would actually see them in the world. The world viewed faces from a minimum of 18 inches of social distance, not from 2 inches of magnified scrutiny. This was good advice then and remains good advice, though the popularity of the high magnification beauty mirror in contemporary vanity culture suggests that it has not been universally heeded. In 1955, a woman's jewellery box told 2 different stories simultaneously, and the tension between them was one of the defining social anxieties of mid-century feminine self-presentation. The first story was the one she hoped her visitors would read, a small, well-chosen collection of real jewellery, perhaps a strand of genuine pearls given at her wedding, a diamond chip or 2 in gold settings inherited from her mother, a small brooch of genuine gold with a coloured stone that had been her grandmother's, suggesting old money, or at least established taste, or at minimum the restraint that refused to acquire everything the department stores were so enthusiastically offering. The second story was the real one. The rest of the box was full of costume jewellery. The faux pearls from Richelieu and Corot and Miriam Haskell, the rhinestone brooches that caught light as effectively as diamonds at a party, the gold tone link bracelets and the clip-on earrings in every possible stone colour, the statement necklaces in chunky jet and coral and turquoise. And this second story was not a story of failure. It was in fact the story of one of the most creative and commercially vital industries of the post-war period. Costume jewellery had existed since the early 20th century, when the French couture houses, Chanel most prominently, had decided to treat paste stones and gold plate and base metal findings not as shameful substitutes for the real thing, but as deliberate aesthetic choices, objects that had their own integrity precisely because they made no claim to be precious. Chanel wore her own ropes of fake pearls with a defiance that was itself a kind of statement, implying that any woman who understood beauty and style would know that the pleasure of a necklace had nothing to do with its material value and everything to do with what it did for a face and a neckline. This was, as philosophical positions go, entirely ahead of its time, and the rest of the fashion world caught up with it slowly. By the 1950s, costume jewellery had arrived at a moment of genuine artistic flowering, and the jewellery box on the American vanity table was where its fruits were stored. The jewellery box itself was an object of considerable variety. The most basic version was a simple fabric-covered box with a hinged lid and a tray insert. The tray held rings and small earrings in individual compartments lined with velvet, while the interior of the box below the tray accommodated necklaces and bracelets coiled loosely on more velvet. These were sold at department stores and dime stores and gift shops, and were often given as birthday presents, arriving wrapped in tissue inside a larger box smelling of fresh velvet and cardboard. They range from genuinely flimsy, the sort of thing that gave out after 2 years and left its velvet lining coming away from the cardboard, to solidly constructed with a mechanism that allowed the tray to lift straight up when the lid was opened, revealing the lower compartment without requiring the contents to be disturbed. The more ambitious versions of the jewellery box incorporated mirrors, often a small interior mirror in the lid, and sometimes a rotating base with drawers that pulled open to reveal organised rows of storage. These were the province of the women's gift department at better department stores, at Marshall Field's in Chicago, or Bullock's in Los Angeles, or Feline's in Boston, and they were sold with the same language of feminine self-care that surrounded the vanity table itself. Every woman deserves a beautiful place for her beautiful things. Some women had small armoires, jewellery chests of miniaturised cabinet design with a finial on top, and narrow doors that opened to reveal a series of shallow drawers, and these were treated as furniture in their own right, placed on the vanity table or on the dresser surface, and regarded as semi-permanent fixtures of the room. The organisation of a 1950s jewellery box was both practical and philosophical. Practicality demanded that pieces be kept separated, the chains of necklaces tangled if allowed to lie together, and untangling them was a minor but genuinely irritating task that every woman who had ever suffered through it tried to avoid through better storage. This is why the jewellery box manufacturers produced those narrow vertical compartments for necklace storage, each one just wide enough for a single coiled chain, or the ring of small hooks along the inside of the lid from which individual necklaces could hang separately. Practicality also demanded easy access, since a woman selecting her earrings on a weekday morning had approximately 90 seconds to spare for the operation before she was late. The philosophical organisation went deeper. Women of the period tended to organise their jewellery not by material. Mixing costume with real would have felt chaotic and somehow wrong, but by occasion and colour. Day jewellery occupied one section. The small pearl clip earrings, the gold circle pin, the simple strand of beads in neutral tones. Evening jewellery occupied another. The rhinestone parure, the elaborate faux emerald clip-ons that required a certain confidence to wear, and rewarded that confidence with extraordinary effect in candlelight. The statement necklace that had been purchased for a specific event and remained in rotation for special occasions. Summer jewellery, the shell and coral pieces, the turquoise, the lighter materials, went in a third category, seasonal as clothing and rotated in and out with the wardrobe accordingly. The parure, the complete matched set of necklace, earrings, bracelet and sometimes brooch, all in the same design and stones, was the ne plus ultra of the mid-century costume jewellery collection, and the better parure manufacturers, particularly those producing for the better department store market, produced pieces of such technical craft and visual richness that they have become serious collector objects in the decades since. Miriam Haskell's pieces, with their hand-wired seed pearls and Russian gold plate and elaborate floral constructions, are now exhibited in museum collections and command prices at auction that would have startled the women who bought them at retail in the 1950s. The Haskell necklace that sat in a velvet compartment on the vanity table, alongside $10 of Cora rhinestones, is now a museum piece. Context transforms objects with a completeness that would amaze their original owners. The contemporary jewellery storage solutions marketed to women today, the clear acrylic tower with its rotating necklace hooks and ring roll and earring grid, perform exactly the functions of the mid-century jewellery box and participate in the same organisational logic. The velvet is gone in most cases, replaced by transparent acrylic that allows the collection to be surveyed at a glance, which is a genuine improvement on the opaque lid of the traditional box, but loses the sense of guarded treasure that the velvet-lined case implied. Some women have returned deliberately to the vintage jewellery box, bought at estate sales or antique markets, lined in original faded silk or velvet, carrying the faint smell of old powder and the particular damp cedar of objects that have sat in storage, because they find in it a relationship to the objects inside that the acrylic tower, for all its practical virtues, cannot replicate. The old box makes the jewellery feel special by treating it as something worth protecting. That logic was the same in 1955 and it remains entirely valid now. The system of gift-giving that surrounded jewellery in the mid-century period was a social and economic language with its own grammar, and the jewellery box on the vanity table was its archive. Engagement rings were at the top of the hierarchy. The solitaire diamond in a gold setting, typically purchased by the man from a jewellery store where the salesman guided him through the available options, and the concept of the 4 C's, was just beginning to be introduced into public discourse by De Beers, which had been running its A Diamond is Forever advertising campaign since 1947. The engagement ring went into the best section of the jewellery box, the one with the velvet padded ring slot rather than the loose tray where other rings might shift in transit. The wedding band stacked beside it. Together they constituted the foundation of the collection, the irreplaceable items around which everything else was organised. Below the engagement ring and wedding band, the hierarchy of jewellery gifts followed a calendar logic. Christmas was the great jewellery-giving occasion, and the department stores prepared for it with dedicated advertising campaigns from October onward. The pearl necklace, real, cultured or simulated depending on the budget, was one of the most reliably successful Christmas jewellery gifts, partly because it was universally appropriate, it suited every occasion, every neckline, every age, and partly because it was available at every price point. The cultured pearl industry had been transformed by the Japanese pearl farming operations of Mikimoto, which by the 1950s were producing cultured pearls of sufficient quality and consistency to be sold at prices that placed them within reach of middle-class American buyers who could never have afforded natural pearls. A single strand of cultured pearls in a velvet presentation box was the jewellery gift that said, "You deserve something beautiful and I know what beautiful means," and it sat in the jewellery box on the vanity table for the rest of the recipient's life. Birthdays called for something more personal and more colourful. The birthstone ring, the charm bracelet with its first charm, the small earrings in a colour specific to the recipient. Anniversaries required both more expense and more thought. The cultural convention of anniversary gifts by year, paper for the first, cotton for the second, silver for the 25th, gold for the 50th, was taken seriously enough in the 1950s to generate gift-giving supplement inserts in women's magazines, with the jewellery options for each anniversary year laid out alongside the more conventional material choices. The 25th anniversary was a jewellery inflection point, the moment at which a husband who'd been observing the anniversary with modest gifts was expected to produce something of real significance. And the silver anniversary bracelet or the upgrade of the original engagement stone to something of grander dimension were both standard choices that produced the expected response. The piece went onto the wrist or the hand at the celebration dinner and then into the velvet compartment of the jewellery box, where it joined the archive of the relationship's documented history. The resale value of the mid-century costume jewellery that filled the rest of the jewellery box was, at the time of its purchase, not considered and, at the time of purchase, essentially zero. A $10 Coro rhinestone set was worth $10 when it was new, and worth perhaps nothing when its owner tired of it or outgrew its particular moment. This has changed with the passionate specificity of collectors' markets, and the Coro brooch that cost a nickel at a 1970s estate sale now commands serious attention. The women who wore this jewellery in its original context would have found the collector's interest both flattering and puzzling. Flattering because the pieces were, by any honest standard, beautifully made and beautifully designed, and puzzling because the whole point of costume jewellery in 1954 was that it was accessible, that it democratised glamour, that it put the look of precious stones in the hands of women for whom precious stones were simply not available. The jewellery conversation between women of the 1950s was a specific social dialect with its own rules of decorum. Complimenting a piece of jewellery was acceptable and expected. Asking its price was not. Asking where it had come from. "Oh, is that Miriam Haskell?" Or, "Is that from Tiffany?" was acceptable and could be a genuine compliment, since being recognised by a knowledgeable observer was its own form of validation. Admitting that a piece was costume rather than real when asked directly was also acceptable, though the directness of the question was itself a slight social transgression that most well-mannered women would not commit. The distinction between "is that a real ruby?" slightly rude, and "what a beautiful colour in those stones?" perfectly appropriate, was the kind of social navigation that the women of the period had absorbed so thoroughly it operated below the level of conscious decision. The jewellery box on the vanity table held not only the pieces being currently worn, but also the pieces in retirement. The brooch from a decade ago that was no longer in fashion, but had been well made enough to keep. The earrings that required repair, and had been placed in a corner of the box with the intention of being taken to the jeweller, and then had remained there for 2 years. The jewellery box was an archaeological site as much as a wardrobe tool, and the woman who opened it knew its stratigraphy as well as she knew the contents of any other organised space in her household. The bottom of the box, beneath the tray and the organised compartments, was where things accumulated that had no clear home. The single earring whose partner had been lost, the broken chain whose repair had never been undertaken, the small brooch whose pin mechanism was sprung. This lower archaeological layer of the jewellery box was a record of small failures of maintenance that the organised upper layer refused to acknowledge. The vanity table had 2 lives, and the second one began when the public day was over. The woman who had sat at that surface at 7 in the morning to build the face that would accompany her through the hours between breakfast and dinner returned to it at 10 or 11 at night for an entirely different kind of work, the systematic and ritualized removal of everything she had spent the morning constructing. This evening ritual, the cold cream, the tissue, the toner, the preparatory applications for the following morning, was in some ways more intimate than the morning application, because it was the ritual of the private face, the face that existed between performances, the face that only the woman herself and perhaps her husband saw. It was the face of preparation, of maintenance, of the ongoing project of appearing acceptable, and it was conducted at the vanity table with the same deliberateness as the morning's work, but in a different register, quieter, slower, without the urgency of an approaching deadline. The cold cream was the foundation of the evening ritual, and the jar of cold cream that occupied a prominent position among the vanity's nighttime tools was one of the most culturally freighted objects of the era. Pond's cold cream had been selling American women on the concept of cleansing cream since the 1800s, and its advertising in the 1950s was among the most sophisticated and socially perceptive in the cosmetics industry. The Pond's campaign of the early decade, which featured real women of social prominence, brides from prominent families, wives of ambassadors and executives, positioned cold cream not as a cosmetic luxury, but as a mark of proper feminine self-management. The implication was clear: women of quality cleansed their faces with Ponds before bed. Women who did not were making a statement about the kind of woman they were, and it was not a flattering statement. The cold cream was applied in quantity, scooped from the jar with the fingertips, never with a spatula, which would have required an additional object and a level of fussiness that the ritual did not invite, and pressed across the face in circular motions that were supposed to both dissolve the day's cosmetics and stimulate the circulation of the skin. It smelled of mineral oil and rose water, and the particular clean chemical note of emulsified lanolin, a smell that most women of the era associated so strongly with the pre-sleep ritual that encountering it in any other context produced an immediate and visceral memory of the bedroom, the night, the quiet before the morning. The cream was removed with soft white tissues taken from the box that sat beside the cold cream jar, and the tissue came away bearing the day's face in soft, almost painterly smears. The foundation and powder as a pale base, the eyeshadow in its graduated tones, the mascara in dark, spidery trails, the lipstick in its particular shade, blurred now, everything blurred. After the cold cream came the toner. The vocabulary for this product was less standardized than it would later become. It appeared under various names in various contexts as astringent when it contained alcohol and was positioned for oilier skin types, as skin freshener when it was lighter and meant for drier or more sensitive skin, as clarifying lotion in the higher-end brands that preferred scientific-sounding nomenclature. Pond's sold its own version. Rubinstein sold hers. The function was agreed upon across all of them: to remove any cold cream residue that remained on the skin after the tissue stage, to close the pores against overnight contamination, to restore the skin's surface to a state of taut receptivity for the preparations that would follow. Applied on a cotton ball and swept across the face and neck in upward strokes. Beauty writing of the era was insistent about upward strokes, always upward, as if the laws of gravity had a particular cosmetic menace that could be partly countered by directional application. The toner left the skin feeling tight and slightly cool and chemically clean, in a way that the cold cream alone had not. Then came the night cream, which was the subject of considerable investment and considerable argument. The major cosmetics houses of the 1950s had each developed their own proprietary night cream formulations, which they sold with claims of varying ambition. At the scientific end of the spectrum, Helena Rubinstein's laboratory-associated marketing implied that her night cream contained active ingredients of proven efficacy. At the more mystical end, various European imports suggested that their formulations incorporated plant extracts and mineral compounds, whose mechanisms of action were not explained but were gesturally implied to be very impressive. What all of them contained, in various proportions, was essentially what Pond's cold cream contained: emollients, occlusives, humectants, occasionally a small amount of something fragrant. The dermatological science of the 1950s had not yet identified the specific mechanisms by which retinoids affected cell turnover, or by which hyaluronic acid operated as a moisture magnet. It knew that some creams left the skin feeling softer in the morning than it had felt the night before, and it sold this experience as a promise. The preparation of the hair for sleep was the last element of the Vanity table's night ritual, and it was conducted with the same methodical attention as the face. The pin curls had to be set for the following morning, which meant sectioning the hair into its designated wave pattern, a skill learned through practice and executed with the speed of habit by women who had been performing it nightly for years. Securing each section with a small metal clip, and then covering the whole construction with a hairnet, often supplemented by a scarf or, for women whose husbands had more permissive views of the bedtime aesthetic, a foam rubber curler cap that kept everything in place regardless of movement in the night. The bobby pins and clips were kept in a small dish or tray on the vanity table, ceramic or glass, close enough to reach easily. By the time the last clip was in place and the net was tied, the woman at the vanity was neither the public self of the morning nor quite the private self of pure rest. She was a third thing, a figure in preparation, neither finished nor begun, occupying the threshold that the vanity table had always been designed to house. There is something in this nightly return to the vanity table, the removal of the constructed face, the preparatory work for the next construction, that speaks to a quality of mid-century feminine life that does not reduce comfortably to either victimhood or agency. The women who performed these rituals were not simply following orders, they were practicing a form of self-maintenance that was onerous by any objective measure, the time, the expense, the discipline it required. But that also constituted a genuine area of expertise and quiet authority. The vanity table was where that expertise lived. It was where the knowledge accumulated, where the products were arranged and rearranged according to what worked, where the face was examined with the honesty that daylight and a good triptych mirror made possible. It was the room within the room, the private office of appearance, and the women who inhabited it every morning and every night understood its particular power, even if the culture that constructed it never gave them adequate credit for doing so. The evening return to the vanity endures in every nighttime skincare routine photographed and shared in the contemporary world. The woman seated at her lighted mirror removing the day's makeup with a cleansing balm that descends from Pond's in a direct developmental line, applying a serum whose active ingredient list would have bewildered a 1953 cosmetics chemist, but whose fundamental logic, put something beneficial on the skin before sleep and let the night do its work, would not have surprised her at all. The vanity table remains, the ritual remains, the triptych of reflection, the lamp that tells the truth or a flattering version of it, the organised surface with its bottles and puffs and brushes and creams, all of it persists, in updated materials and with updated science, performing the same essential cultural function that it performed in the bedroom of the 1950s. The most important piece of furniture in the room is still watching, still holding the evidence of the daily work of being a woman in the world, still keeping its faithful and unhurried record of the face. The hand cream that sat on the vanity table alongside the face preparations was a separate category of care with its own product hierarchy and its own ritual logic. The hands were among the most visible parts of a woman's body in the 1950s, constantly present in social interactions in ways that the legs or the neck or the upper arms were not. Reaching across a luncheon table, accepting a handshake, presenting a teacup, placing a gloved hand in another's, and the condition of the hands was accordingly noticed and judged. A woman with beautiful hands was praised for something that was partly nature and partly care. A woman with rough red-knuckled hands was assumed to be someone whose domestic labour had overwhelmed her self-care routine, or whose circumstances did not permit the products and practices that might have prevented the roughness. Jergens lotion had been selling Americans on the possibility of beautiful hands since 1905, and its advertising in the 1950s maintained the warmly aspirational tone it had perfected over decades. The close-up of soft, smooth hands engaged in some quietly feminine activity. The confident claim that regular use would transform the hands from the casualty of housework into something worth noticing. The positioning of hand care as a specific subcategory of the vanity table's concerns was a marketing achievement that required careful navigation. The hand cream had to be positioned as sophisticated enough to belong on the vanity surface rather than solely beside the kitchen sink, but practical enough to acknowledge that the damage it was repairing was domestic in origin. Jergens, along with Pond's, which sold a hand cream alongside its famous cold cream, and the pharmaceutical-adjacent products like Nivea, which had crossed from Germany to the American market and brought with it a reputation for serious efficacy, rather than cosmetic luxury, all managed this navigation with varying degrees of grace. The practice of wearing gloves, which was not merely a fashion accessory, but a genuine hand care strategy in the 1950s, had a direct relationship with the vanity table's hand care products. Women who wore gloves during housework, rubber gloves for dishwashing, cotton gloves for dry tasks, were protecting the hands from the alkaline detergents and drying heat that caused the roughness that hand cream was then obliged to address. Women who wore white cotton gloves to bed after applying a heavy hand cream were engaging in an overnight occlusion therapy that anticipated by several decades the professional paraffin wax treatments and overnight moisturizing gloves that would appear in Spartan Cosmetics advertising in later eras. The intelligence that was being applied to the vanity table ritual extended to the hands, and it was being applied with the same empirical rigour, trying things, observing results, adjusting the approach that characterised the rest of the mid-century woman's relationship with her appearance. The evening return to the vanity for the night ritual had a quality of completion that the morning ritual with its forward-directed urgency could not quite achieve. In the morning, the vanity was a preparation. At night, it was a resolution. The face that had been built in the morning was unmade at night, and the unmaking brought with it a specific quality of relief. Not the relief of removing something burdensome, exactly, but the relief of arriving at the end of the day's performance, of no longer being required to present a finished face to the world. The cold cream going on, the mascara dissolving, the foundation releasing from the skin with a softness that a tissue absorbed. All of it suggested not an erasure but a natural conclusion, the completion of a daily arc that had a satisfying formal logic to it. The vanity table held the tools of both the construction and the dismantling, and the woman who sat at it at both ends of the day understood, perhaps without quite articulating it, that these two rituals together constituted something more than grooming. They constituted a practice of self-attention, daily and ongoing, that was as close as the mid-century domestic world permitted to the concept of self-care. The vanity table was where that practice lived. The hour that elapsed between a woman's return from an evening event and her actual arrival at the vanity table for the night ritual was often consumed by the subsidiary tasks that preceded the vanity. The removal of gloves in the front hall, the shoes placed on the closet shelf, the dress hung carefully rather than dropped, the stockings peeled off with the particular care that sheer nylons required if they were to survive for another wearing. By the time she arrived at the vanity table, the evening had been materially unwound to the point where only the face remained dressed. The face came last in the dismantling, both chronologically because the rest of the evening's clothing required attention first, and symbolically because the face was the last armour to be removed. The final presentation of the public self before the private self could be admitted. The vanity table at this hour had a particular quality of quiet that it did not have in the morning. In the morning it was surrounded by the sounds of the house waking, the coffee percolating in the kitchen, the radio program beginning, the husband moving through the hallway, the sense of the day pressing in with its requirements and its timing. At night the house was still, and the woman at her vanity table worked in the particular silence of the household wound down, the children asleep, the evening's conversation concluded. The cold cream went on in this silence. The tissue came away bearing the evidence of the day in this silence. The night cream was pressed around the eyes in this silence, and the fingers that applied it moved with a gentleness that the morning's more purposeful hands had not always employed. The vanity table at night was the quietest room in the house, and the woman at its surface was the most entirely herself of all the versions of herself that the day's various contexts had required. This is the quality that the contemporary concept of skincare as self-care attempts to recreate, the deliberate, slow, attentive quality of the night ritual at the vanity table, stripped of its mid-century social requirement and reframed as an act of autonomous self-regard. The jade roller moved across the face in the bathroom mirror, the gua sha stone lifting along the jawline, the sheet mask pressed gently around the eye socket. These are the contemporary equivalents of the cold cream and the night cream and the careful patting of the 1950s vanity ritual. The technology has changed. The chemical sophistication of the products has changed enormously. The quiet intentionality, the woman attending to her own face with care alone at the end of the day by the light of a lamp that tells the truth, has not changed at all.